Hello and welcome to Buy the Book. This is your host, Joe Hebert. Today we'll be continuing our discussion of Machiavelli's Prince, and we'll be delving into chapters 1 to 3. But before we do that, a brief recap of what we talked about last time. In looking at the dedicatory letter to the Prince, we saw that Machiavelli is writing for posterity. He's leaving this book to us and to try to have an influence over us. That his main subject and the wisdom that he's distilling into this book is his understanding of the actions of great men through history, which he has distilled both from his reading of history as well as from his personal experience in political life and reflecting on human nature. In connection to that, Machiavelli talks about how important it is to understand both the great and the people. And we'll see that both of those will be very important aspects of his teaching in The Prince, understanding human nature in light of the powerful and the not so powerful, basically, is the way he's going to divide people. We also see that he has a certain enmity with fortune. He is suffering from malign fortune, and that he's setting up for a sort of contest with fortune and a conquest of fortune, which is going to be central to his teaching in this book about leadership. And finally, that this is a book about leadership, not simply in terms of grasping power, although a lot of it will be heavily focused on that, as we'll see, but is also attempting to set up a vision for society. And in fact, what Machiavelli believes is a new vision for a new kind of society. And ultimately, this is why the book is so important and is I think, a good place to start in this course, even if we're going to question certain of the principles that Machiavelli articulates in this book. So before we delve into chapter 1, I'd like to take a brief look at chapter 15, the middle of the book, because at that point, Machiavelli pauses for a moment and he discusses some of the differences between his take on political life and the treatises that had come before him. In the dedicatory letter, we noticed that he had said there would be no fluff in his work, by which we thought that he was alluding to the fact that he's removing moral or ethical concepts from his book. And that will again be his hint in chapter 15. But in particular, I want to look at these words here from that chapter. He says, "I fear that in writing of the modes of government of a prince again, that is, after so many other authors, I may be held presumptuous, especially since in disputing this matter, I depart from the orders of others." Now, what does he mean by the orders of others that he's departing from? For one thing, as we get into this course, we'll see that for classical thinkers, the concept of order is really central to human life and to political life. Morality or ethics is focused on understanding and acting in accordance with the order of things. And so in denying classical ethics, Machiavelli is really denying the order that is embedded in that way of thinking. And a good way to see that, turning to chapter 1, is to think about the way that classical authors categorized regimes. And so if we look at Aristotle, who's a student of Plato, who's a student of Socrates, so going back really to the beginning here, Aristotle is the first to write a treatise on political science per se. And in his political science, he says that we can categorize political regimes, and we categorize them on the basis of two different criteria. So to begin with is who is ruling? And the options here are simply the few, or the many. So one person is in charge, a few people are in charge, or the many, the majority, or a large number of people are in charge of the regime. So obviously that's an important criterion, but it's not all there is. Aristotle says we also have to judge the regime in terms of how they rule, particularly do they rule justly for the common good, or do they rule unjustly for their own advantage or what they think is their own advantage at the expense of others? And so if we divide regimes according to those principles, we get 6 different possibilities. In reality, of course, it's a lot more complex, but 6 basic possibilities. And so if one person is ruling justly, we could say that's a king. If one person is ruling unjustly, we may call him a tyrant. If the few are ruling justly, we might call that an aristocracy, which means the rule of the best. But if a few people are ruling unjustly, we might call them an oligarchy, which means the rule of the rich, suggesting that they're just either abusing their money for power or they're using rule to get rich or something like that, or other pejorative terms we might have for the rule of a few who are corrupt. Now, if the many are ruling well, they're ruling justly. Aristotle calls that politeia, which we could translate as republic. That's the term that we have come to use over the centuries for when the people are in charge, but they rule through law and justice and in the common good. Whereas if the many are ruling poorly, unjustly, corruptly, Aristotle calls that democracy. Today we use the term democracy more synonymously. Actually, we use it more often than the word republic. I think that's actually kind of an impoverishment of our discourse, but that's a question for a different day. But in any case, he uses the term pejoratively to mean a majority that is not ruling well. They're ruling for their selfish interests. And ultimately, that's not for the common good. So a tyrant, an oligarchy, or a democracy are all trying to advance their own interests, but most likely to crash and burn at some point because of the lack of wisdom in what they're doing. So in any case, this is the classical way to look at regimes. And as we're going to see, Machiavelli is going to shift gears in several different ways. First of all, because he eliminates any discussion of justice or morality other than an imaginary thing that can be useful to imitate or to pretend. So you can put on an act of being just. You can justify your crimes. If you have to commit crimes, you can justify them. This is the only way Machiavelli is going to look at justice or morality. So that eliminates the distinction between a king and a tyrant, or aristocracy and oligarchy. Those aren't going to be distinctions that Machiavelli makes. Of course, he does recognize the existence of the one, the few, and the many. And right from the beginning, we're going to see that Machiavelli acknowledges that there are principalities, by which he means the rule of one person, and there are republics, which means rule by the many, by the people. Interestingly, he's not really going to talk about a regime that corresponds to the rule of the few. He will talk about the few. He's going to call them the great. And as we'll see as we get into the book, his overall recipe is going to be for the prince and the people to gang up against the great. So he is playing around with the one, the few, and the many in a somewhat different way from classical authors. But right from the get-go, we're also going to see that Machiavelli does not use the one, the few, or the many as a primary way of categorizing regimes. His primary way of categorizing them is instead about how power is acquired. Whether you're one or the people or whoever you are, how did you get your power? And how can you keep your power? And how can you expand your power? That's what he is interested in, to the extent that he is going to actually categorize regimes on that basis, rather than paying much attention to any other way of categorizing or labeling them. So now turning to chapter 1, the title of this chapter is How Many Are the Kinds of Principalities and in What Modes They Are Acquired? It begins by telling us that all states, all dominions that have held and do hold empire over men have been and are either republics or principalities. So again, he's sort of skipping over the middle possibility here. Notice also that his terminology is heavily focused from the beginning on power. Dominion, empire. This is only going to become more evident the further we get into the book, that for him, this is what it's all about. He goes on to say, the principalities are either hereditary, in which the bloodline of their lord has been their prince for a long time, or they are new, So he's now turning on sort of the transfer of power, but he says there's two possibilities for, say, like a prince or king. You inherit your power, or it's new. Now, what does he mean by new? If you're not inheriting, what are you doing? He's going to explain now. The new ones are either altogether new, as was Milan to Francesco Sforza, or they are like members added to the hereditary state of the prince who acquires them, as is the kingdom of Naples to the king of Spain. So there's two things he's looking at here for the new, and both of them are interestingly, well, I would almost say ambiguous, but the first one, if you look at Sforza, we're going to see a little bit more about him later. And suffice to say, he acquired his new kingdom by force, by staging a coup, by committing murder and things like that. Okay, so that's the first example that Machiavelli gives of a new, a path to new power. And the other one is he talks about Spain and Naples. We're going to see more examples of this in this chapter with France and Italy. This is going back to the feudal times when power was transferred by inheritance. So you would inherit the throne or inherit a dukedom or something like that. And so what that meant was that somebody could be the king of France or the king of Spain, but because of their family ties, they would say, I also have a right to this, this city or this, dukedom in some other place disconnected from my primary seat of power. And so, the kings of England believed that they should also be kings of France because of their hereditary claims. The kings of France believed that they had a right over parts of Italy because of their family claims. The kings of Spain believed they had rights in Italy as well. So those, I'd say, more ambiguous, right? I mean, what exactly is the legal status of it? In effect, they're also using force to actually try to uphold those claims because of the geographical distance, the language differences, and other things. Those people are not jumping into their laps and saying, oh yeah, be our king. So in effect, even though they have some legal argument for it, they are using force to try to actually get control over those areas. So those were both violent means. That's an important thing for us to see here. Finally, in this chapter, he goes on to say the following: dominions so acquired, which basically we've seen means by force, are either accustomed to living under a prince or used to being free. So interestingly, he acknowledges that there's a difference in character between a republic or a kind of freer society versus a monarchy, and that people are attached to that. If they have freedom, they're attached to it. So he did write an entire book on republics, which he's going to mention in chapter 2. So this is an important thing to bear in mind, is that Machiavelli he does have more to say about republics than what he is going to say in this book. And they are acquired either with the arms of others or with one's own. So now he's starting to get into distinctions that he will be delving into in great depth in the rest of the book. So notice how he's just narrowing down on violent conquest. And as he concludes this chapter, he's going to be categorizing the whole topic, the whole focus of the rest of this book in terms of violent conquest. So one of the major distinctions in violent conquest is, are you using your own arms or using somebody else's arms? And related to that is, are you conquering by fortune, which means chance, luck? Are you just getting lucky to get extra power? Or are you doing it by virtue? Now, virtue is an extremely important concept. We'll be talking about virtue a lot through this entire course, because every serious thinker about leadership in society has some notion of what virtue is. Not always exactly the same concept, way of understanding it. But the basic meaning of the word virtue is excellence or perfection, and is typically associated with moral, both intellectual and moral virtue, intellectual and moral perfection. As we're going to see, Machiavelli has a very distinctive way of using the term virtue. And this is one of the biggest issues, by the way, with different translations. Many translations will translate the word virtù in Italian in many different ways in different contexts in this book. And I think that's quite unhelpful because it's such an important word for him. And we want to track every time he uses that word and watch how he uses it. Because for any serious thinker, the word virtue is a very important term. It's literally is the goal or purpose of life is to achieve as much virtue as possible. And as we're going to see here, Machiavelli is going to associate the word virtue as an antithesis to fortune. So virtue is not relying upon fortune. Virtue is relying upon your own arms, as he puts it here. And in general, as we'll see, virtue is achieving control over anything and everything that affects you. So in chapter 2, Machiavelli talks about hereditary principalities. And it turns out to be a relatively short chapter again. And note that hereditary principalities are the ones that you do not conquer on your own. You don't use your own arms, and you don't use your own skill or ingenuity to acquire them. So the nice thing about them, Machiavelli is going to say here, is that it's easy. You don't really have to do anything. And also, it's harder to lose them because people are used to it. Like they expected you to be the ruler. And so, that's what they come to expect. You just have to be not dumb, basically, he says. You have to be of average ingenuity or skill to be able to maintain them. So that's fine, and that's great. But as Machiavelli proceeds, we've already noticed that he put more of an emphasis in chapter 1 on how you acquire for yourself. And as Machiavelli delves into that, which is going to be his main topic, it turns out that he's actually much more interested in that. And part of the reason, as we'll see in chapter 3, is that those who know how to acquire and to acquire with their own arms and their own skill, their own virtue, are actually going to run circles around the people who are depending upon things like heredity. So if you're leaning on the fact that you inherited power, it means that you're relying upon fortune. You're relying upon something that you did not do and you don't control. And that is going to be a recipe for disaster, according to Machiavelli. So in chapter 3 is where Machiavelli really begins to share some of his practical wisdom, also his theoretical wisdom with us. He's going to start really defining major concepts and the major techniques that he's going to recommend to us on how to acquire, maintain, and expand power. So Machiavelli begins with the difficulties of a new principality. But as we're going to see, that, and in discussing the difficulties, he's actually looking at the opportunities and ultimately the advantages of knowing how to expand power in this way. So the difficulties, he said, in a new principality begin with the fact that men willingly change their lords in the belief that they will fare better. Now, this is actually something that helps you to achieve power, because whatever power you want, and you look at who's currently in power, you know that some people will resent them. Some people will be chafing under their bit. And those are the people that are your natural allies. You can make friends with them. They'll help you to come in and get power. So that's not a problem. The problem is what he says next, is that they're deceived by their experience because they realize later that they've done worse. Now, they're talking about you. They've switched from the previous ruler to you, and then they realize they're doing worse. Why is that? It has to do with motives. And motives and psychology are a huge part of chapter 3. He's really trying to get us to understand his view of human nature. That is, why do you want power? Do you want it for them? No, you want it for yourself. Why did they resent their ruler? Why did they want your help? It's not for you, it's for them. So just like you want power, they want power, or they want something. And just like your desire for power is pretty much endless, as Machiavelli will be portraying it, you want more and more power. Whatever they want more and more of it. And he goes on to say in a bit, you're not going to be able to satisfy them. And these are his reflections on that. He says, he talks about what's natural and ordinary necessity. So he's using a lot of philosophical terms For this is the way things are. This is not an accident. It's not something that sometimes happens. This is the way things are. And in this case, he says that one must always offend those over whom he becomes a new prince. The term offense is very important. Machiavelli doesn't mean by offense simply making somebody upset. As we'll see, he means depriving them of something all the way to the point of potentially killing them, which he will actually recommend, as we'll see in a minute. If you're going to offend somebody, go all the way. But he said it's necessary and natural that you would offend those over you have, which you have become a new prince. So you have his enemies, all those whom you have offended in seizing the principality. That was your offense against them. You took their power away from them. But you cannot keep as friends those who have put you there, because you cannot satisfy them in the mode they have presumed, and because you cannot use strong medicines against them, since you are obligated to them. So Machiavelli introduces the term medicine here. Medicine cures a disease or a sickness. And the sickness in this case is your friends who helped you to get power. Why are they a sickness? Because predictably they will turn against you. You will not be able to satisfy them. And being selfish as they are, they will betray you. But he also brings in this concept of obligation, which is a moral concept. And notice the way he brings it in. He doesn't make a strong moral statement. He just says, gee, what are you going to do? Your friends are guaranteed to betray you, but you can't use strong medicine, which would mean you can't offend them. You can't attack them because they haven't attacked you yet. And they just got done helping you. So you're obligated to them. So how can you use medicine against them, which means using violence against them, since you have a moral obligation to them? So his first actual reference to morality here is he's posing it as a problem and as an obstacle to success. You've got a problem. It's not just a random problem. It's a necessary, natural problem that you will have 100% of the time. And if you can't solve it, you're doomed. But the problem, the major obstacle to solving the problem is morality. So, of course, as we're going to find out, dispensing with morality will be part of the solution. But before he jumps to that, he wants us to stew in this problem. He wants us to actually feel for ourselves that morality is a constraint on us, so that when he gets to the point of advising that we put it aside, we're going to feel a sense of relief. We're going to feel like, oh, fine, that's necessarily what we're going to have to do here if we want to succeed. So next he says the universal causes of the first failure of Louis XII. Now, what is he talking about? One of his main examples in this chapter are the kings of France, including Louis XII, who attempted to take territories in Italy. As mentioned, they had hereditary claims, and they would occasionally go and try to take these lands. And they would eventually always fail and get booted out again. And so Machiavelli wants to explain this. Actually, if you look at what he says here, the first he says is explained pretty easily, which is simply that he couldn't betray his friends, and they betrayed him. And what was he going to do about it? As we'll see, that's not really a valid excuse for Machiavelli, but for now he takes that as a valid excuse. But he says, what about the second time? Because once your friends betrayed you once, then what's stopping you from betraying them the next time? So this is really a mark of failure on Louis's part, that he wasn't able to figure this out even on the second time around. So it remains now to say what were the causes of the second, and to see what remedies there were to him. And remember, remedies, he's already associated with violence, which someone in his situation could use so as to maintain himself better in his acquisition than France did. So notice that the specific problem that Machiavelli is going to try to solve in this chapter is, how could France have succeeded at gaining territory in Italy? A lot of people look at Machiavelli's Prince and they look at all the ugly stuff in it and they say, well, it sounds really immoral, but Machiavelli was just an Italian patriot, and he was so fired up with patriotism that he just got carried away and he recommended some dastardly things. But notice his very first lesson in the book is the French keep trying to invade Italy and they keep failing. How could they succeed? Let me see if I could come up with a plan to help the French to succeed. Now, this isn't because Machiavelli particularly loves the French and wants them to succeed at invading Italy, but it is because Machiavelli's goal in this book is much bigger than just some kind of patriotic fervor for his country or something. He's writing a book that is going to revolutionize the way we think about power and how to consolidate power. And there are no moral constraints. That is part of what he's trying to say. So giving advice on how somebody could conquer his own country is just one of the subtle little ways that he's showing us that this requires overcoming moral constraints to be able to think in the most ruthless possible terms about power consolidation. So in reflecting on the expansion of French territory, he makes another one of these distinctions. He says, when you're gaining new territories, they might have the same language and customs, or they might have different language and customs. And obviously, it's going to be easier to conquer places that have similar language and customs. But even then, when he's describing how easy that is, he says, oh, all you have to do is just a couple things. What are they? One of the things that you have to do is that you have to make sure that the bloodline of their ancient prince is eliminated. Now, what does that mean? It means whoever's on the throne, not only do you have to kill that person, but you have to kill their children. You have to kill their brothers and sisters and their children. You have to kill anybody in that family who could possibly come now or in the future and say, I have a hereditary right, because the people being used to that bloodline ruling might rally around that person. And remember, people always envy whoever's in power. That's going to be you if you're in power. And you can't leave any competitors alive. So that's the easy thing. The easy thing for Machiavelli is to eliminate a whole bloodline, to eliminate an entire family. For this has to be noted, he goes on to say, that men should either be caressed or eliminated because they avenge themselves for slight offenses, but cannot do so for grave ones. So the offense one does to a man should be such that one does not fear revenge for it. So in other words, if you're going to offend somebody, go all the way to the point where they can't get revenge, because you've deprived them of life. You've deprived them of any possible means of coming back at you. So this is Machiavellian virtue, right? It's not to avoid offending, it's to offend in such a way that people cannot retaliate, to be able to predict when those retaliations are going to come and to stop them before they can happen. That is virtue for Machiavelli. And that's how we're going to conquer fortune, by the way, is to be able to understand what people are going to do before they do it and to control that, to act and to eliminate what goes against you and to only keep and harness what is going to be in your favor. Getting into another major lesson about power expansion, Machiavelli says the following. The order of things is such that as soon as a powerful foreigner enters a province, all those in it who are less powerful adhere to him, moved by the envy they have against whoever has held power over them. So the same theme of envy. How is he going to use it now? He says with his forces and their support, he can easily put down those who are powerful so as to remain arbiter of that province in everything. In other words, people, if you're powerful, people may resent you for your power. How do you deal with that? One of your main tactics is that you look for other powerful people and you realize people do envy them, and you can deflect their envy towards the other powerful people. And that's very convenient, not only because it takes the pressure off you, but also because when you go and you conquer that person to get their power, you look like the good guy because you're going after somebody that they envy and resent. So this is going to be a primary tactic of power consolidation, is you always have to vilify your competitors, make it look like your competitors are the real bad guys, to take the pressure off yourself and to deflect the envy and the negative attention that might be directed towards you. It has the double virtue of shielding you from envy, but also giving you an excuse or justification for going after your competitors. So it's perfect. Okay, and as it turns out, where did Machiavelli get this wisdom? He tells us he got it from the Romans, from the ancient Romans. And this is the other major theme in this chapter is the Romans. So we notice that Louis of France and other contemporaries, in fact, throughout the book, all of the contemporary rulers Machiavelli talks about are failures. Some of them are brilliant, but they ultimately all fail. And but the Romans, he says, they were wise and they succeeded. They built a tremendous empire and they maintained that empire for a very long time. How did they do it? Well, they did it precisely by being able to anticipate these problems that Machiavelli is talking about and to always be one step ahead of everybody. And in particular, their strategy was that they would not allow any other rival to get powerful. When they saw that any country was getting powerful, they would go after it. But how would they do that? Would they just say, "Hey, we don't want you being powerful. We're going to go after you"? No, that wouldn't look good. So what they would do is they would simply look at the envy of others, of weaker countries, their envy against those stronger countries, and they would take their side. They would say, "Oh, this country has a complaint. This weak country has a complaint against this strong country, and we're going to use that to launch a just war to go after this unjust country and set them straight." So for Machiavelli, justice is actually a facade and it's something that can be used for power consolidation, but it's really based on envy and the desire for power. You want the power that this other strong country has, and other weaker countries envy them. So you take advantage of that envy to frame them as a bad guy, and then you have an excuse to go in and you do this, as he emphasizes, you do it early. You do it before they get too powerful, because once they're too powerful, that's going to be really tough to do. But if you anticipate they're starting to get powerful, that's your moment for going in, because it's still going to be easier to conquer them at this point. Nor did that saying ever please them, he says, which is every day in the mouths of the wise men of our times. So notice how he's contrasting the actual wisdom of the Romans to this sarcastic wisdom of his own times, which doesn't work. And that is to enjoy the benefit of time. Oh, wait, you'll have time later. Take your time. Instead, the Romans enjoyed the benefit of their virtue and prudence. So he comes back to this term virtue, and it makes it clear that what he's talking about with virtue is a kind of prudence, but it's actually it's not classical prudence because it's not moral. As we'll see, prudence in the classical sense is a moral virtue or compatible with morality. But for Machiavelli, prudence is being able to anticipate how other people will respond, when they're going to help you, when they're going to hurt you. And then virtue is being able to seize the opportunity to eliminate your rivals. So how would King Louis, getting back to the problem of Louis and why did he fail? This is when it's really going to get interesting, okay? Because what did Louis have to do? He had to be like the Romans. He had to anticipate who's going to betray them, and he had to act first and eliminate, whoever was going to be his rival. And so why did he not do that? We're going to find out. No sooner was he in Milan than Louis did the contrary of Machiavelli's advice by giving aid to Pope Alexander so that the Pope might seize Romagna. In those days, the popes were not only the head of the church, but they also had territory and they had armies. And they would fight sometimes. They were, as with the other principalities and republics and everything, they were part of the power struggles that were going on there. And so the Pope was one of the friends who helped Louis to come into Italy. And he was one of the friends who then betrayed Louis, causing him to then be booted out of Italy. So this gets really interesting. How would you apply the wisdom of the Romans in this situation? Going on, Machiavelli says, nor did he, Louis, notice that with this decision he was weakening himself, stripping himself of his friends and those who had jumped into his lap. That is the other weaker powers that he could have utilized as per the strategy that we're looking at. But he didn't do it. Why? Because he wouldn't break with the Pope. He would not break his alliance with the Pope, even though the Pope was not going to actually help him to keep power in Italy. The Pope was using him. So, as a consequence, Machiavelli says, he made the church great by adding so much temporal greatness to the spiritual one that gives it so much authority. So this is loaded. This is extremely loaded because Machiavelli is trying to teach us a technique that he learned from the Romans and saying we need to apply this technique if we want to consolidate power. But it runs into a problem, not just the problem of morality that we saw before, which we're going to have to dispense with, as he's going to mention in a minute, officially, that we have to dispense with morality. But it's not just that we have to learn to be immoral, but it's very specifically the person that we have to betray, the person that we have to offend. And remember, if you're going to offend, you have to eliminate. So who do we have to eliminate? We have to eliminate the Pope. But whoa, wait a minute. The Pope is not, he is a prince in Machiavelli's sense. He has armies, he has territory, but he's not just a prince. As Machiavelli says, he has temporal greatness, but he also has spiritual greatness and spiritual authority. So what do you do about that? Are you going to, for the sake of temporal power, are you going to betray the Pope who has spiritual authority? And he's going to come back to that in a minute. But what else are you going to do? Right? I mean, if you're not going to betray the Pope, then we might as well put this book back on the shelf, right? What are we going to learn from this book? You're not going to be able to consolidate power if you can't betray who you have to. By nature and necessity, you have to betray your rivals. But what if your rival is somebody with spiritual power? Well, if you're a spiritual person, that would be an inherent problem. But as we're going to see, Machiavelli is not really a spiritual person, but even from his point of view, that's still going to be a challenge because we'll get to in a minute, but you're not going to look good to others if you do something like that. But before he gets further into that problem of the Pope, Machiavelli stops to tell us something about morality. He now officially tells us what he thinks about it. He says, truly is a very natural and ordinary thing to desire to acquire, and always when men do it who can, they will be praised or not blamed. So human nature is acquisition. Later, he's going to break it down into some different categories of acquisition, but everybody universally is defined by the desire to acquire, according to Machiavelli. And what will we be praised or blamed for in relation to this? Praise and blame, this is the way that he's alluding to morality, because generally we praise people and blame people in moral terms. They're good or they're bad, they're right or they're wrong. But Machiavelli here says that actually the only thing that we really praise people for deep down is success. When they succeed at acquiring, then they will be praised or not blamed. At least nobody's going to blame you if you succeed. But when they cannot and wish to do it anyway, here lie the error and the blame. So without even saying the word morality, he has just obliterated morality from the world. He is, again, he's going to say morality exists as a kind of a superficial phenomenon that people talk about and they react to it. But deep down, nobody really cares about it. All they really care about is success. And if you succeed, you're going to be fine. Nobody's going to blame you. In fact, they're going to admire you for your success. So morality is not and cannot and should not be an obstacle. Okay, now let's get back to Louis and the Pope. So how's this going to apply? Boy, obviously you got to betray the Pope according to this, right? You can't be moral, but what are the consequences of that? What are the consequences if you offend the Pope? You're going to have to eliminate the Pope. You can't just offend him a little bit and then he's going to come back after you, right? So how does Machiavelli deal with this? He says, and if some other should cite the faith that the king had pledged to the Pope, boy, a loaded term, because literally all it means is he made a promise. Faith is just, keeping your promises. But obviously in this context of the spiritual authority of the Pope and the church, he's talking about the Catholic faith. So his lesson is you got to break faith, you got to break your promises. But in this context, it means you have to violate your religion. It's big stakes that he's talking about. So if some people cite this faith that the king had pledged to the Pope to undertake that enterprise for him in return for dissolving his marriage and for the hat of Rouen. Now, why does Machiavelli mention this? There were part of the bargaining between Louis and the Pope was that the Pope allowed Louis to change wives, and he made a deal with him about who was going to be Cardinal of Rouen. Now, Rouen, obviously being a city in France. So what is Machiavelli mentioning this for? I think he's mentioning this because he's showing the spiritual authority of the Pope. Part of why that's important is that the Pope has power, not just in Italy, in his own territories. The Pope has power throughout Europe. The Pope has the ability to keep Louis in his marriage or give him an annulment and allow him to marry somebody else. The Pope has the ability to decide who's going to be cardinal or not of major cities in France, which will have a major effect on French politics and public life. So, in other words, the French king is under constraints by the power, by foreign power, the power of the Pope. That interferes with his ability not just to conquer Italy, it interferes with his ability to rule his own country. So the nature of the spiritual authority that the church has for Machiavelli is particularly pernicious, or using his metaphors, it's like a disease that is infested. It's not only like, your outer limbs, it's getting into your inner organs. This is a disease that prevents you from consolidating power at all, really, even in your own territories. The Pope has power in France, and with that kind of power within France, he can manipulate Louis all day long. And what is Louis going to do about it? If he turns on the Pope, he's going to be in trouble with his own people, who are going to think that he's an apostate, that he's Antichrist or something, right? So how does Machiavelli reply? He says, I reply with what I will say below on the faith of princes and how it should be observed. So he doesn't give a direct response. He says, later in the book, that's chapter 18. Later in the book, I'll tell you. Well, if you turn to chapter 18, what does he say about keeping faith? He says, don't do it. You can lie, and you can lie all day long as you do it well and you follow the prescriptions that Machiavelli gives. You can lie and get away with it. So don't keep faith. Now apply that to the church. What is Machiavelli insinuating? He's never going to come out and tell us what to do about the Catholic Church, by the way. If he had written down what he wanted to do about the Catholic Church, the book never would have been published. But he keeps hinting at it throughout the book. The Catholic Church is the primary problem in the world, according to Machiavelli. And he's going to keep hinting to us over and over again, somebody's got to do something about it. And so he concludes with this: for when the Cardinal of Rouen said to me, this is the one that, of course, the Pope and the king made a deal over. He said to me that the Italians do not understand war. I replied to him that the French do not understand the state, because if they understood, they would not have let the church come to such greatness. So the church is the problem. And this is the first major chapter in the book, the first major lesson in the book about the consolidation of power, and the first step towards Machiavelli's vision for a new world. And the first lesson is that, of course, morality is skin deep. You don't have to care about morality. Acquisition of power comes from predicting the behavior of others and betraying them before they can betray you. But in terms of application, how to apply that to the world as it then exists, the chief obstacle to implementing it will be the Catholic Church. And there will need to be some kind of a plan to successfully be able to get the church out of the way.